He spat on an old man in a diner, not knowing the man had once held a hilltop against hundreds alone. 30 minutes later, 3 military helicopters descended on the town like thunder in a quiet storm. Welcome to Dusk Tales. Let's uncover what really happened. Elias Thorne, 84 years young, as he often quipped to the empty corners of his small cottage, moved with the deliberate slowness of a man who had learned patience from time itself. His mornings were a ritual etched in the quiet solitude of a life lived mostly in retrospect. He'd rise before the sun, the cool pre-dawn air a familiar companion, and prepare a simple breakfast, oatmeal, perhaps a piece of toast, a cup of tea brewed weak, just as he liked it. His hands, gnarled by age, and something more, something unspoken that lay deep in the lines of his palms, moved with a practiced economy. Today, like many Tuesdays, he decided a trip into the small town of Harmony Creek was in order. Not for anything essential, really. He had his pension, meager but sufficient, and his garden provided a surprising bounty in the warmer months. No, these trips were more about observing the flow of life, a quiet participation from the sidelines. He donned his usual attire, a worn but clean flannel shirt, sensible trousers, and a faded baseball cap that had seen better decades. It bore no insignia, no allegiance to any team or cause, much like Elias himself in these later years. He walked the mile and a half to the bus stop, his gait steady if unhurried, the old service-issued cane tapping a quiet rhythm on the pavement. The town's only diner, the Sparrow's Nest, was his usual destination. It wasn't for the gourmet food, which was serviceable at best, but for the familiar hum of conversation, the clatter of cutlery, the comforting anonymity it offered. He'd sit in the same booth near the window, if it was free, order a coffee, black, and watch the world go by. Sometimes Sarah, the middle-aged waitress with kind eyes and a perpetually tired smile, would chat with him for a moment, asking about his roses or the weather. He appreciated these small kindnesses more than he could ever articulate. He was, by most accounts, an unremarkable old man. Thin, slightly stooped, with eyes that seemed to hold a distant sorrow, yet capable of a surprising twinkle if something amused him. Few in Harmony Creek knew much about him. He'd moved to the outskirts of town some 20 years ago after his Martha passed. He kept to himself, a polite but reserved figure. Some thought him eccentric, others just old and lonely. No one suspected the fires he had walked through, the storms he had weathered in a life that now seemed as faded as his cap. Today, however, the usual peace of the Sparrow's Nest was to be shattered. As Elias settled into his booth, a group of men swaggered in, their leather vests adorned with the garish patches of a motorcycle club, the Road Vultures, their emblem a carrion bird picking at a skull. They were loud, boisterous, their laughter harsh and grating in the otherwise quiet diner. Their leader, a burly man with a tangled beard and eyes like chips of cold flint, surveyed the room with an air of proprietary arrogance. He spotted Elias, the solitary old man in the corner, and a cruel smirk twisted his lips. He and his companions took the large table in the center, their voices booming, their demands for service curt and dismissive. Elias tried to ignore them, focusing on the steam rising from his coffee cup, the familiar comfort of the diner. But their presence was a disruption, an unwelcome intrusion of coarseness into his quiet world. He felt a prickle of unease, a faint echo of old alertness he thought long buried. The encounter that would change everything, that would ripple far beyond the confines of the Sparrow's Nest, was yet to come, but the air was already thick with a tension only Elias, perhaps, could fully sense, a storm gathering on a seemingly clear day. Welcome to QH. Let's uncover what really happened. The leader of the Road Vultures, who went by the name Ripper, seemed to take a particular, malicious interest in Elias. Perhaps it was Elias's quiet dignity, his refusal to be intimidated, or simply the vulnerability of an old man sitting alone that made him a target. Ripper and his cronies had ordered a large breakfast, complaining loudly about the quality of the food and the slowness of the service, all while leering at Sarah, who handled their boorishness with practiced, weary professionalism. Elias sipped his coffee, trying to make himself smaller, invisible, a skill he had honed in far more dangerous environments. But Ripper wasn't to be ignored. "Hey, old man," Ripper bellowed across the diner, his voice laced with contempt. Several conversations ceased. Forks clattered onto plates. "What are you staring at? Ain't you never seen real men before?" Elias slowly raised his head, his gaze calm, meeting Ripper's challenging stare. "I was just enjoying my coffee, son," he said, his voice quiet but firm. The "son" seemed to enrage Ripper further. He pushed back his chair, the legs scraping harshly against the linoleum floor, and sauntered over to Elias's booth, his companions snickering behind him. He loomed over Elias, a mountain of leather and menace. "So, you got a lot of nerve, old-timer. You know who we are." Elias didn't flinch. "I know you're disturbing the peace in this diner," he replied, his voice still even. This quiet defiance, this refusal to cower, seemed to infuriate Ripper beyond measure. His face turned a mottled red. "Disturbing the peace? We're the peace around here, Grandpa. And you? You're just a waste of space, a relic nobody cares about." He leaned closer, his breath reeking of stale beer and cigarettes. "You veterans, you think you're all so special, don't you? Fought in some forgotten war nobody gives a damn about anymore. What did it get you, huh? Sitting here alone, looking like death warmed over." Elias's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The reference to veterans, the casual dismissal of sacrifices Ripper couldn't begin to comprehend, struck a deeper chord than any personal insult. Still, he remained silent, his eyes holding a profound sadness rather than anger. This, too, seemed to fuel Ripper's cruelty. He wanted a reaction, a fight, a display of fear. Elias offered none. Then, in an act of pure, unadulterated contempt, Ripper hawked and spat directly onto the worn sleeve of Elias's flannel shirt. A collective gasp went through the few patrons who dared to watch. Sarah cried out, "Hey, stop that!" But one of Ripper's men shot her a look that silenced her. The glob of spittle, ugly and demeaning, clung to the fabric. Elias looked down at it, then slowly, deliberately, he reached for a paper napkin from the dispenser. He didn't wipe it off. He simply looked back up at Ripper, his eyes no longer sad, but filled with a cold, hard light that Ripper, for all his bluster, found unsettling for a fleeting moment. "There was no call for that," Elias said, his voice barely a whisper, yet carrying the weight of immense disappointment. Ripper, recovering his bravado, sneered. "Oh, I think there was. Just putting you in your place, old man. You and your kind." He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound, and turned back to his table, his cronies roaring their approval. "Let's get out of this dump," Ripper announced. "Food stinks, and so does the company." They swaggered out, leaving a trail of stunned silence and simmering indignation in their wake. The diner owner, a nervous man named Henderson, no relation to Elias, a fact that always brought a private smile to Elias's face, emerged from the kitchen, wringing his hands. Oh dear, I'm so sorry, Mr. Thorne. Those men, they're trouble. I'll get you a fresh coffee on the house." Elias slowly rose, placing $1 on the table for his unfinished cup. "No, thank you, Mr. Henderson. I think I've had enough for one day." He walked out of the diner, the spittle still on his sleeve, his shoulders perhaps a little more stooped than before, but his head held high. The humiliation was a bitter taste in his mouth, not for himself, but for the uniform he had once worn, for the comrades he had lost, for the ideals that seemed so easily spat upon in this modern, careless world. Do you believe that true strength is shown in quiet endurance rather than loud aggression? And what debt does society owe to those who sacrifice for its freedoms, even if those sacrifices are now deemed forgotten? Elias Thorne didn't go straight home. The mile-and-a-half walk felt longer today, each step heavier than the last. The encounter at the diner replayed in his mind, not the fear or the anger. Those emotions were like old, distant battle scars, occasionally aching but no longer raw, but a profound sense of weariness. He had seen the worst of humanity in his youth, the calculated cruelty, the senseless violence. He had hoped, perhaps naively, that such naked contempt was a relic of a darker time. To see it now, so casually displayed in a small-town diner, directed at him not for who he was, but for what he represented, an old soldier, a veteran, was a fresh kind of wound. He found himself on a familiar path leading to the town's small, somewhat neglected cemetery. Martha was buried here, under a simple stone shaded by an ancient oak. He often came here to talk to her, or rather, to talk at her, sharing the small details of his days, the memories that surfaced unbidden. Today, he sank onto the old wooden bench near her grave, the silence of the cemetery a welcome balm after the diner's harshness. He finally took the soiled napkin and carefully wiped the spittle from his sleeve, his movements precise, almost ritualistic. He didn't discard the napkin immediately, but folded it neatly and placed it in his pocket, a strange, unwelcome memento. "They don't understand, Martha," he murmured, his gaze on the weathered inscription of her name. "They don't understand what it cost. Not just me. So many good lads." His mind drifted back, not to specific battles. Those were a chaotic blur of noise and fear he rarely allowed himself to revisit, but to the faces. Young faces, full of bravado and terror, camaraderie forged in the crucible of shared danger. He remembered Lieutenant Davies, always quoting Shakespeare before a patrol, who never came back. Private Miller, who'd shown him pictures of his newborn daughter he'd never meet. Sergeant Rodriguez, who had pulled him from a burning foxhole, taking a bullet meant for Elias. These were not abstract memories. They were ghosts who walked with him, silent companions in his solitude. In a small, locked wooden box back at his cottage, wrapped in oilcloth, were the medals. A silver star, 2 bronze stars, a purple heart. They weren't on display. He rarely looked at them. They weren't trophies. They were reminders of the price, paid in blood and youth, for freedoms now taken for granted, or worse, actively scorned by men like Ripper. He had tried, after Martha passed, to join a local veterans group, but he'd found it difficult. The stories, the shared pain, it was all too raw, too close. He preferred his solitude, his quiet routines. But was this solitude a comfort, or had it become a kind of prison, isolating him from a world that had, perhaps, forgotten how to remember? As he sat there, lost in thought, a young woman approached hesitantly. It was Emily, Sarah's daughter, a college student who sometimes helped out at the Sparrow's Nest. She had been there earlier, clearing tables, and had witnessed the whole ugly scene. She held a small, steaming takeaway cup. "Mr. Thorne," she said softly, I brought you a coffee. Mom said you didn't finish yours. And I'm so sorry about what happened. Those men were awful." Elias looked up, surprised. Her genuine concern was a small, unexpected warmth in the chill of the morning. "Thank you, Emily. That's very kind of you." He accepted the coffee, his hand trembling slightly. "Are you all right?" she asked, her brow furrowed with worry. Elias managed a faint smile. "I've been through worse, child. Much worse. But thank you for asking. It means a good deal." Emily lingered for a moment, unsure what else to say. "My grandfather served," she offered, "in Korea. He never talked about it much, but he always said respect wasn't something you demanded, it was something you earned. And that some people never earned it, no matter how loud they shouted." Elias nodded slowly. "Your grandfather was a wise man." After Emily left, Elias sat with a warm coffee cup in his hands, her small act of kindness a counterpoint to Ripper's venom. It was a reminder that not everyone was callous, not everyone had forgotten. But the feeling of helplessness, of being a forgotten relic, lingered. He didn't know it then, but Emily's concern and her quiet anger at what she'd witnessed would be a tiny, unseen spark. She would later recount the incident to her uncle, a retired Army major who lived in the next county, a man who still had connections, a man who believed that some lines should never be crossed, especially when it came to honoring those who had served. The wheels were beginning to turn, slowly, silently, in a way Elias could never have predicted. While Elias Thorne sought solace in the quiet company of the departed, the ripples of the morning's ugly incident were already spreading, unseen by him. Emily, deeply disturbed by what she had witnessed, hadn't just mentioned it to her mother. She had called her Uncle Joe as soon as her shift ended. Major Joseph Rourke, retired, was a man who, despite his civilian status, still lived by a code of conduct forged in decades of service. He listened intently to Emily's tearful account, his anger a cold, controlled burn. Disrespecting an elder was bad enough. Disrespecting a veteran, particularly in such a vile manner, was, in Joe Rourke's book, an intolerable offense. "Did you get a good look at these bikers, Em? Their patches, any names?" Emily, observant like her mother, provided a detailed description of the road vultures and their sneering leader. She also described Mr. Thorne, his quiet dignity, his worn flannel shirt, the way he had simply absorbed the insult without retaliation. "He just looked so sad, Uncle Joe, like he was used to it." Those words resonated with Major Rourke. He knew too many veterans who had returned from service only to find themselves adrift, their sacrifices misunderstood or ignored by a society quick to forget. He made a few calls. The Veterans Network is a strange and wonderful thing, often invisible to the civilian world, but potent and far-reaching. It operates on shared experience, mutual respect, and an unspoken understanding that some bonds are thicker than blood. His first call was to a former sergeant major he'd served with, a man now heading a statewide veterans advocacy group. Within minutes, the description of the road vultures and the incident at the Sparrow's Nest was being discreetly disseminated. Another call went to a contact at the nearest active military base, a sprawling complex some 60 miles from Harmony Creek. It wasn't a formal complaint, not yet. It was more of a heads-up, information shared between men who understood the nuances of honor and respect. The name Elias Thorne, at this point, meant little. He was an anonymous elderly man, a victim of loutish behavior. But the fact that he was identified by the biker as a veteran was key. That word, in these circles, carried weight. Meanwhile, Ripper and the road vultures were miles away, probably congratulating themselves on their bravado, completely oblivious to the invisible net that was beginning to tighten. They might have felt like kings of the road, a law unto themselves, but they had underestimated the silent, enduring power of a brotherhood they had so casually insulted. They had spat not just on an old man, but on a symbol, and symbols have a way of drawing unforeseen consequences. The system that was slowly creaking into motion wasn't about vigilantism or revenge. It was about restoring dignity, about making a statement that such behavior would not be tolerated, that those who had served would not be abandoned to the casual cruelties of the ignorant. It was about honor. Back in Harmony Creek, the afternoon wore on. Mr. Henderson, the diner owner, had called the local sheriff, a portly, nearing retirement figure named Bill, to report the disturbance. Sheriff Bill had taken notes, sighed, and promised to keep an eye out for the road vultures, though both men knew the bikers were likely long gone, and a small department had limited resources. The incident for most of Harmony Creek was already fading, just another unpleasant blip in the day. But for a select few, it was just beginning. The initial inquiries about Elias Thorne were discreet. Did anyone in the local VFW or American Legion posts know him? He wasn't a member. Did his name appear on any county records of decorated veterans? Not immediately. He was, as he had been for years, a ghost, a man living on the periphery. But the persistence of the network was formidable. Someone, somewhere would know something. And the description of the man, elderly, quiet dignity, likely a combat veteran given Ripper's taunts, began to resonate. There were men like Elias Thorne scattered all across the country, men who had come home and simply disappeared into the quiet corners of America, their stories untold, their medals unworn. But they were never truly forgotten by those who understood. The information gathering was methodical, patient. It was the kind of groundwork that preceded any significant operation, a careful assessment of the terrain and the objective. The objective here wasn't punishment, not primarily. It was recognition. It was a reassertion of values. And it would be delivered in a way that Harmony Creek, and certainly the road vultures, would never forget. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Harmony Creek as Elias Thorne finally made his way back to his small cottage. He felt drained, the emotional toll of the morning's events far outweighing any physical exertion. He tended to his small rose garden, the familiar routine of pruning and watering a small comfort. Martha had loved these roses. He often felt her presence strongest here, amongst the fragrant blooms and the buzzing of bees. He made himself a simple supper, ate it slowly at his small kitchen table, the silence of the cottage pressing in on him. He thought about Emily's kindness, a small bright spot in a dismal day. He wondered, briefly, if he should have said more at the diner, stood up for himself more forcefully. But what would have been the point? To engage with men like Ripper on their level was to diminish one's self. He had learned long ago that true strength often lay in restraint, in choosing dignity over rage. He picked up the local weekly paper, the Harmony Creek Herald, but the small-town news couldn't hold his attention. His mind kept drifting back, not just to the diner, but further, much further, to dusty roads and the smell of cordite, to the fear and the courage in the faces of the young men who had relied on him, their sergeant. He hadn't thought of himself as Sergeant Thorne in decades. He was just Elias, then Martha's Elias, and now, just old Mr. Thorne from the cottage on Willow Lane. Yet, the man who was Sergeant Thorne still lived within him, buried deep but not extinguished. He rarely spoke of his service, not even to Martha in their later years. The memories were too heavy, the losses too profound. He carried them alone, a silent burden. He hadn't sought glory then, and he certainly didn't seek it now. He had simply done his duty as best he knew how. That, he believed, was all any soldier could do. Unknown to him, the discreet inquiries by Major Rourke's network had finally borne fruit. A clerk at the Department of Veterans Affairs, a woman whose own father had served with distinction, had cross-referenced the limited information, approximate age, possible service era hinted at by Ripper's forgotten war taunt, and the vague location of Harmony Creek. The name, Elias Thorne, had eventually surfaced, linked to a service number and a list of commendations that made even the hardened clerk draw a sharp breath. The information was immediately, and with a new sense of urgency, relayed up the informal chain of command that Major Rourke had tapped into. Suddenly, Elias Thorne was no longer an anonymous elderly victim. He was a name with a history, a distinguished history, and the act of disrespect against him took on an even graver significance. At the nearby military base, Brigadier General Alastair Finch was reviewing the afternoon's reports when an unusual communication landed on his desk. It wasn't an official order, but a personal message from a highly respected retired colleague, detailing the incident in Harmony Creek and the now-confirmed identity of Elias Thorne. General Finch had known of Sergeant Elias Thorne by reputation, a near-legendary figure from a previous generation of warriors, a man whose exploits were still occasionally recounted in hushed, reverent tones in certain circles. That such a man was living in obscurity and had been subjected to such a vile indignity struck a deeply resonant chord with the general. This was not just about an assault on an old man. It was an assault on the legacy of service, on the honor of the uniform. General Finch was a man of action. He looked out of his office window at the flight line, where several utility and transport helicopters sat gleaming in the late afternoon sun. An idea, audacious and deeply symbolic, began to form in his mind. It wouldn't be a military intervention in the traditional sense. This was a civilian matter, after all, but a demonstration of respect, a powerful statement of solidarity, was well within his purview. He picked up his secure phone. A few carefully chosen words, a quiet coordination with trusted subordinates, and a plan was set in motion. The objective, Harmony Creek. The purpose, to render honors and perhaps to deliver a lesson. The timing would be crucial. It needed to be swift, impactful, and unforgettable. Elias Thorne, meanwhile, was preparing for bed, oblivious to the forces his quiet suffering had unleashed. He laid out his clothes for the next day, wound the old alarm clock, and took one last look out at the moonlit garden. He felt a familiar ache in his old wounds, a reminder of prices paid long ago. He hoped for a quiet night, for dreams untroubled by the ugliness of the day. He had no idea that the coming dawn would bring something far more astonishing than the usual sunrise over Harmony Creek. The first indication that something extraordinary was afoot came just as dawn was breaking over Harmony Creek. A deep, rhythmic whumping sound, distant at first, then rapidly growing louder, began to permeate the morning stillness. It was a sound unfamiliar to the sleepy town, a sound that spoke of power and purpose. Elias Thorne, an early riser by habit, was already in his kitchen, the kettle just beginning to whistle for his morning tea. He paused, his head cocked, a flicker of old instinct stirring within him. That sound, he knew that sound. It was the thrum of rotor blades, and not just one, but several. He stepped out onto his small porch, peering into the pale, pre-dawn sky. And then he saw them. 3 large, dark green helicopters flying in tight formation, not high above, but descending purposefully towards the open field that bordered the edge of town, adjacent to the main road where the Sparrow's Nest Diner and, a little further down, the only bar in town, the Rusty Mug, a known haunt of transient biker groups, were located. Elias watched, his heart suddenly pounding in his chest with an intensity he hadn't felt in years. This was no civilian joyride. This was military. But why? Why here? In Harmony Creek? Lights began to flicker on in neighboring houses. Faces, bleary with sleep and confusion, appeared in windows. The helicopters, with practiced, almost balletic precision, settled onto the dew-kissed grass of the field, their rotors kicking up a whirlwind of dust and leaves. Doors slid open, and figures began to emerge, not in combat gear, but in crisp, immaculate dress uniforms. Elias could make out the glint of polished brass, the sharp creases of their trousers, the unmistakable bearing of career soldiers. His mind reeled. This couldn't be a coincidence. But what could it possibly mean? The news of the helicopter's arrival spread through Harmony Creek like wildfire. Phones began to ring, sleepy voices exchanging bewildered questions. Sheriff Bill, roused from his bed by a frantic call from a farmer whose cows had been spooked, was already speeding towards the field in his cruiser, his mind racing through a dozen unlikely scenarios. At the Rusty Mug, which often saw late-night stragglers and early morning preparations for whatever illicit activities might be planned, the few individuals present, including a couple of road vultures who had crashed their overnight, were jolted awake by the incredible noise. They stumbled out, blinking in the nascent daylight, their hangovers momentarily forgotten, to witness the unbelievable sight of 3 military helicopters parked practically on their doorstep. Ripper, who had spent the night in a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, was blissfully unaware, probably still sleeping off the previous day's cheap beer and cheaper bravado. His awakening, when it came, would be considerably ruder. The figures emerging from the helicopters were not just any soldiers. Elias, even from his distance, recognized the insignia of rank. There were officers, senior NCOs, men who carried an aura of authority that was palpable even from afar. One figure, taller than the rest, with the unmistakable gold braid of a general officer on his cap, seemed to be directing the others. They weren't storming the town. They weren't armed for combat. They moved with a quiet, disciplined purpose, forming up into neat ranks beside their aircraft. Then, a smaller group detached itself and began walking, not towards the town center, but along the road, directly toward the Sparrow's Nest, and beyond it, the Rusty Mug. The tension in Harmony Creek was electric. Fear, confusion, awe, and 1,000 unanswered questions hung in the morning air. The day had barely begun, and already it was unlike any day the town had ever known. Elias Thorne stood rooted to his porch, the forgotten teacup growing cold in his hand, a lifetime of buried memories and emotions surging to the surface. He had a terrible, dawning premonition that this incredible display, this unprecedented arrival, had something, somehow, to do with him. And he wasn't sure whether to feel dread or a strange, unfamiliar flicker of something that just might be hope. What happens when the quiet ripples of an injustice encounter the unyielding rock of a deeply held code of honor? The answer was descending upon Harmony Creek with the force of a thunderclap. The group of uniformed personnel, led by Brigadier General Alastair Finch himself, walked with measured, deliberate steps along the quiet main street of Harmony Creek. Their polished boots crunched softly on the gravel shoulder of the road, the only sound apart from the distant, idling thrum of the helicopter rotors and the rising chorus of barking dogs. Residents, drawn by the commotion, peered from behind curtains or stepped cautiously onto their porches, their faces a mixture of apprehension and intense curiosity. Sheriff Bill's cruiser, lights flashing, pulled up alongside the marching contingent. He clambered out, looking flustered and out of his depth. "General, sir," he stammered, recognizing the rank despite his surprise. "Sheriff Bill Wilkins, Harmony Creek PD. Is there a problem, General? An emergency?" General Finch paused, his expression polite but firm. "No emergency, Sheriff. Just a matter of overdue respect." He didn't elaborate, simply nodded and continued walking, his men falling in step behind him. Sheriff Bill, thoroughly bewildered, could only watch them go, then quickly got back in his cruiser to follow at a discreet distance. Their first stop was the Sparrow's Nest. It was just opening for the day. Sarah, her eyes wide with astonishment, was unlocking the front door. Mr. Henderson, the owner, was in the back, probably just starting the coffee. General Finch didn't enter. He simply stood before the diner, his gaze sweeping over its familiar, unassuming facade. He seemed to be taking it all in, perhaps imagining the scene from the previous day. A few of his aides made quiet notes on clipboards. Then, with a curt nod, he turned and continued down the road towards the Rusty Mug, the real destination. The air outside the Rusty Mug was thick with stale beer and apprehension. The two road vultures who had witnessed the helicopter's land were now joined by a few more of their brethren, roused from whatever stupor they'd been in. They stood in a loose, uncertain group near the entrance, their usual bravado visibly diminished, replaced by a sullen, wary truculence. They watched the approaching military contingent with a mixture of disbelief and dawning unease. This wasn't a couple of local cops they could intimidate or ignore. This was something else entirely. General Finch and his men halted a respectful distance from the bar. They didn't shout. They didn't issue commands. They simply stood there, a silent, powerful reproach. Their immaculate uniforms, their disciplined bearing, their sheer numbers, were a stark contrast to the disheveled appearance and boorish demeanor of the bikers. For several long moments, no one spoke. The tension was a palpable thing, thick enough to cut with a knife. The bikers shifted uneasily, muttering amongst themselves, their eyes darting nervously towards the helicopters in the nearby field. Finally, General Finch spoke, his voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable edge of steel. "We are looking for the leader of the group, calling themselves the Road Vultures," he stated. A man known as Ripper. One of the bikers, a scrawny individual with a nervous twitch, gestured vaguely down the road. "He ain't here. Stayed at the motel." "We are also looking," General Finch continued, his gaze sweeping over the uneasy group, "for any individual who was present at the Sparrow's Nest diner yesterday morning and participated in, or condoned, the verbal abuse and physical assault of an elderly citizen, Mr. Elias Thorne." There was a flicker of recognition, and then fear, in some of their eyes. They had assumed their actions had no consequences beyond the immediate gratification of their cruelty. They were rapidly discovering how wrong they were. Before anyone could respond, a dusty pickup truck rattled to a stop a short distance away. Elias Thorne, his face pale but resolute, climbed out. He had felt compelled to come, to see this through whatever it was. He still didn't understand the full picture, but he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this was about him, about what had happened. He walked slowly towards the assembled groups, his old cane tapping softly. When General Finch saw him, his stern expression softened immediately. He stepped forward, breaking formation, and extended his hand. "Mr. Thorne? Or, if I may, Sergeant Thorne?" Elias looked at the offered hand, then at the general's face, a dawning understanding and a wave of overwhelming emotion washing over him. He took the general's hand, his grip surprisingly firm. "General," he said, his voice hoarse, I don't understand." "You will, Sergeant," General Finch said gently. You will. First, there are some civilities to observe. He turned back to the bikers, his demeanor once again hardening. It seems your leader is absent. A pity. But perhaps some of you can enlighten us as to why a decorated war hero, a man who has sacrificed more for this country than any of you could possibly comprehend, was subjected to such a disgusting display of disrespect in this town yesterday. The directness of the accusation, the term decorated war hero, hung in the air, stunning the bikers into a defensive silence. The patrons of the Rusty Mug, who had gathered at the windows and doorway, looked on with wide, disbelieving eyes. The script of their ordinary morning had been irrevocably torn apart. The term decorated war hero echoed in the charged silence, not just among the bikers, but also registering with Sheriff Bill, Sarah the waitress who had just arrived having heard the commotion, and a few other townsfolk who had gathered at a safe distance. They looked at Elias Thorne, the quiet, unassuming old man they knew, and then back at the imposing figure of General Finch, trying to reconcile the two. The bikers, stripped of their leader's bravado, looked trapped. One of them, perhaps bolder or more foolish than the rest, mumbled, "We didn't know who he was. Just some old guy." General Finch's eyes narrowed. "And that makes it acceptable? To abuse an elderly man, regardless of his past? Is that the code you live by?" He didn't wait for an answer. He turned to one of his aides, a captain, who stepped forward holding a slim, official-looking folder. "Captain Reeves, if you would." Captain Reeves cleared his throat. "Sergeant Elias Thorne," he began, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air, enlisted in the United States Army on June 7, 1950. He served with distinction in the Korean War with the 2nd Infantry Division. During the battle for Cheopyeong-an in February 1951, then Corporal Thorne, despite being wounded, repeatedly exposed himself to heavy enemy fire to rescue 3 fallen comrades, successfully bringing them back to friendly lines. For this action, he was awarded the Silver Star. A murmur went through the small crowd of onlookers. Elias stood very still, his gaze fixed on some distant point, his face unreadable. The bikers shuffled their feet, their earlier defiance evaporating into a sullen discomfort. Captain Reeves continued. During a subsequent engagement near Heartbreak Ridge in September 1951, Sergeant Thorne, leading a rifle platoon after his lieutenant was killed, successfully defended a critical hilltop position against overwhelming enemy assaults for over 36 hours, despite sustaining further injuries. His leadership and extraordinary courage under fire were directly responsible for preventing a strategic enemy breakthrough. For these actions, he was awarded a 2nd Silver Star, later upgraded by Review Board to the Distinguished Service Cross. The captain paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. The Distinguished Service Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor. Even the bikers, ignorant as they might be of military honors, understood this was serious. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she looked at Elias with new, astonished eyes. Mr. Henderson, the diner owner, who had also arrived, looked pale and shaken. Sergeant Thorne was also awarded 2 Bronze Stars for valor and a Purple Heart with 2 oak leaf clusters, indicating he was wounded in action on 3 separate occasions. Captain Reeves concluded, closing the folder. He then looked directly at Elias. "Sir, your country has not forgotten your service, even if you chose a quiet life afterwards." General Finch stepped forward again. "What you witnessed yesterday, what Mr. Thorne endured," he said, his voice now addressing not just the bikers but everyone present, was not just an attack on an elderly man. It was an insult to the uniform he wore, to the sacrifices he made, to the very principles of honor and respect that men and women of the armed forces dedicate their lives to upholding. He then turned his gaze, like ice, upon the assembled road vultures. "The man you spat upon, the man you denigrated as a relic nobody cares about, is a genuine American hero. A man whose courage you couldn't comprehend, whose boots you are not worthy to polish." His voice, though not raised, was utterly scathing. "Your leader, Ripper, will be paid a visit. He will be made to understand the profound error of his ways. As for the rest of you who were present and participated, or who stood by and did nothing, consider this a lesson. Respect is not earned by leather vests and loud pipes. It is earned by character, by integrity, by service. Qualities that seem to be in very short supply among your kind. Just then, a battered pickup truck, driven erratically, screeched to a halt a little way down the road. Ripper, looking disheveled and alarmed, having been urgently summoned by one of his panicked underlings, stumbled out. He saw the helicopters, the assembled military personnel, Sheriff Bill, and the crowd, and his jaw dropped. He looked from the formidable General Finch to the quiet figure of Elias Thorne, and a flicker of dawning, horrified understanding crossed his face. The old man he had so casually tormented was, it seemed, far more than he appeared. The stage was set for a reckoning Ripper had never anticipated. Ripper, the self-proclaimed leader of the road vultures, stood frozen, his usual arrogant swagger completely deserting him. The sight of 3 military helicopters, a phalanx of uniformed soldiers, and a stern-faced general, all apparently focused on the elderly man he had assaulted the previous day, was a scenario so far beyond his comprehension that it momentarily short-circuited his brain. He looked like a cornered animal, his eyes darting between General Finch and Elias Thorne, a sheen of sweat suddenly visible on his brow despite the cool morning air. General Finch regarded Ripper's arrival with a look of utter disdain. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. His very presence, backed by the silent might of his contingent, was enough to convey the gravity of the situation. "Ah, the esteemed Ripper, I presume," General Finch said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "We were just discussing your conduct. Specifically, your unprovoked and disgusting assault on Sergeant Elias Thorne yesterday." Ripper swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, words failing him. His usual bluster was gone, replaced by a very real, very palpable fear. He was no longer the big man in a small diner. He was a petty thug facing a level of authority he had never encountered. It was a misunderstanding," Ripper finally managed to stammer, his voice a pathetic squeak compared to his earlier bellows. "Misunderstanding," General Finch repeated, one eyebrow arching. "You spat on an 84-year-old man. You verbally abused him, denigrated his service to this country. Explain to me, if you can, what part of that constitutes a misunderstanding." Ripper's eyes flicked towards his now-cowed biker companions, as if seeking support, but they avoided his gaze, suddenly very interested in their boots or the cracks in the pavement. He was on his own. I didn't know. I didn't know who he was," Ripper mumbled, trying to deflect. "He was just an old guy." This seemed to incense General Finch further, though his voice remained dangerously calm. "And that, in your worldview, makes such behavior acceptable? You believe elderly citizens are fair game for your contempt? Furthermore, your ignorance of Sergeant Thorne's decorated service record is an indictment of your character, not an excuse for your actions. A man of his generation, in this country, has a high probability of having served, often in combat. A little respect, a little common decency, might have been in order, regardless of any perceived status." He took a step closer to Ripper, who instinctively recoiled. "You and your associates," the general said, his gaze sweeping contemptuously over the other bikers, "represent a stain on the fabric of this community, a blight on the notion of civilized behavior. Yesterday, you crossed a line. You dishonored not just Sergeant Thorne, but everything he stands for, everything he fought for. The public shaming was intense, brutal in its quiet, authoritative delivery. The bikers, who live by a code of intimidation and perceived toughness, were being systematically dismantled, their pseudo-power exposed as hollow in the face of genuine authority and moral conviction. Sheriff Bill, who had initially been overawed, now stepped forward, emboldened by the general's presence. "Ripper, or whatever your real name is," he said, his voice firmer than usual, "I'm formally charging you with assault on Mr. Thorne. And your little club here is no longer welcome in Harmony Creek. I suggest you pack your bags and move on before you find yourselves facing a raft of other charges related to public nuisance and disturbing the peace. Ripper looked aghast. Local law enforcement, whom he usually treated with disdain, was suddenly finding its teeth. He looked desperately towards General Finch, perhaps hoping for some military intervention on his behalf, some bizarre appeal to a shared masculinity, but the general's face was granite. "This is a civilian matter now, as far as direct legal consequences go," General Finch stated. "However," he added, his eyes locking onto Ripper's, "know this. The veteran community has a long memory, and we look after our own. Word of your actions, and your club's reputation will spread. You may find many roads are no longer as welcoming to you as they once were." The implied threat was far more chilling than any shouted command. It spoke of a vast, interconnected network, a brotherhood that Ripper had foolishly antagonized. Ripper's face, which had been flushed, now turned a pasty white. He seemed to shrink under the weight of the general's gaze. He opened his mouth, perhaps to offer a more sincere apology, perhaps to beg, but no words came out. He had built his persona on being the aggressor, the intimidator. He had no script for this, no understanding of how to navigate a situation where he was so utterly and comprehensively outmaneuvered and morally condemned. His comeuppance was not just legal, but social and deeply personal. He had been publicly stripped of his false pride, his cruelty exposed for all to see. The man who spat on a hero was now revealed as nothing more than a pathetic bully. The humiliation of Ripper and his road vultures was complete. Under the icy gaze of General Finch and the newly assertive Sheriff Bill, they mumbled incoherent apologies, their earlier arrogance replaced by a desperate desire to simply disappear. Sheriff Bill, with a newfound sense of purpose, began taking down their names and license plate numbers, informing them that they were to leave Harmony Creek immediately and not return or face trespassing charges. The message was clear. Their reign of minor terror was over. General Finch then turned his full attention back to Elias Thorne. His demeanor softened instantly, the hard lines around his eyes easing, replaced by a look of profound respect and concern. "Sergeant Thorne," he said, his voice gentle, "on behalf of the United States Armed Forces, and indeed as a fellow serviceman, I want to offer you our deepest apologies for what you endured. No one who has served this nation with such distinction should ever be subjected to such vile treatment." Elias, who had watched the confrontation with Ripper with a quiet, almost detached sorrow, finally spoke. It wasn't for me, General," he said, his voice raspy. "It was the disrespect to all the lads, to what we fought for." General Finch nodded slowly. "I understand, Sergeant. Believe me, I understand. And that is precisely why we are here, to restore that respect, to ensure that your service and the service of all our veterans is remembered and honored." He then gestured to one of his aides, who stepped forward carrying a small, beautifully polished wooden case. The aide presented it to General Finch, who opened it to reveal a pristine, folded American flag, the kind presented at military funerals or to retiring dignitaries, and beside it, a newly minted set of Elias Thorne's campaign medals and his Distinguished Service Cross, gleaming brightly. "Sergeant Thorne," General Finch continued, his voice thick with emotion, "we are aware that you have lived a quiet life, never seeking recognition for your extraordinary valor. However, your comrades, those who served with you and those who came after, have never forgotten. This flag, and these reaffirmations of your justly earned honors, are but a small token of the esteem and gratitude in which you are held." He carefully took the Distinguished Service Cross from the case. "With your permission, sir, I would be deeply honored to present this to you properly." Elias looked at the medal, then at the faces of the soldiers standing at attention behind the general, their expressions ones of profound respect. Tears welled in his old eyes, tears he had not shed in many, many years. He slowly, almost reverently, unbuttoned the top button of his worn flannel shirt. General Finch, with great solemnity, pinned the Distinguished Service Cross to Elias's chest. It lay there, a bright beacon against the faded fabric, a symbol of incredible courage finally brought into the light. For a moment, no one moved. Then, General Finch stepped back and executed a slow, formal salute. Every uniformed member of his contingent, as one, snapped to attention and saluted Sergeant Elias Thorne. The sight was incredibly powerful, a wave of pure, unadulterated respect washing over the small gathering. Sarah, the waitress, was openly weeping. Mr. Henderson, the diner owner, removed his hat and held it over his heart. Even Sheriff Bill looked deeply moved. Elias Thorne, the forgotten hero, stood a little taller, the weight of years seeming to lift from his shoulders as he returned the salute, his hand, though trembling slightly, firm and steady. The long-overdue honor, delivered in such an unexpected and dramatic fashion, was a healing balm, not just for Elias, but for the community that had unknowingly harbored a hero in its midst. The road vultures, now an irrelevant footnote to the day's events, were already an afterthought, their departure unlamented. The focus was solely on Elias, on the restoration of his dignity, on the celebration of his incredible, long-hidden sacrifice. The town of Harmony Creek had received a lesson in history and honor it would never forget. The helicopters, which had seemed a menacing intrusion just hours before, now felt like chariots of justice and respect. The day was far from over, but its most significant chapter had been written, a testament to the fact that true heroism, however deeply buried, can never be truly extinguished, and that honor, when defended by those who understand its worth, is a force to be reckoned with. The formal presentation concluded, but the atmosphere of respect and quiet celebration lingered. General Finch, his official duties done, spent some time speaking privately with Elias, their conversation low and earnest. Old soldiers from different generations, finding common ground in shared experiences of duty and sacrifice. Many of the younger soldiers from the general's contingent approached Elias, one by one, to shake his hand, to offer a word of thanks, their youthful faces filled with awe for this man whose quiet heroism had suddenly been thrust into the spotlight. Elias, though clearly overwhelmed, received their respects with a humble grace that was deeply touching. Sarah brought him a fresh cup of coffee from the sparrow's nest, her eyes still shining. "Mr. Thorne, Sergeant Thorne, I had no idea. We're all so proud of you." Mr. Henderson, the diner owner, profusely apologized for not intervening more forcefully the previous day. "I was scared, Sergeant, I admit it. But there's no excuse. From now on, any veteran eats free in my diner. It's the least I can do." The news of the morning's events and the revelation of Elias Thorne's heroic past spread through Harmony Creek with astonishing speed. The town, which had largely ignored him for 2 decades, now saw him in an entirely new light. People who had barely nodded at him in the street now spoke his name with reverence. The local newspaper, the Harmony Creek Herald, dispatched its only reporter, a young intern, who arrived breathless and wide-eyed, just as the helicopters were preparing for departure. General Finch gave a brief, dignified statement, emphasizing Sergeant Thorne's heroism and the importance of remembering the sacrifices of all veterans. He made no direct mention of the road vultures, but his earlier words had left no doubt as to the catalyst for this extraordinary visit. As the general and his men boarded their helicopters, Elias Thorne stood watching, the distinguished service cross gleaming on his chest. He was no longer just the quiet old man from the cottage. He was Sergeant Thorne, a hero acknowledged, his dignity restored, his service finally, publicly, honored. The helicopters lifted off, one by one, their powerful rotors once again filling the air. But this time, the sound was not one of alarm, but of a mission accomplished, a departure of honor. As they disappeared over the horizon, a profound quiet settled over Harmony Creek, the kind of quiet that follows a significant, life-altering event. In the days and weeks that followed, life in Harmony Creek did change, subtly but significantly. The Rusty Mug, shunned by locals and no longer a haven for disruptive biker gangs, soon closed its doors. The Sparrow's Nest, on the other hand, became a local hub for veterans, with Mr. Henderson making good on his promise. A small plaque was eventually placed in the diner, briefly recounting Sergeant Thorne's valor and the events of that remarkable morning. Elias Thorne himself found his life altered in unexpected ways. He was no longer invisible. People greeted him with genuine warmth and respect. School children, having learned his story, would sometimes stop him to ask about his medals, which he now, occasionally, wore to town events. He reconnected with a few surviving members of his old unit, thanks to the efforts of General Finch's network, and found a new, albeit late in life, sense of camaraderie. He even started attending meetings at the local VFW post, sharing his quiet wisdom and listening to the stories of younger veterans. The cottage on Willow Lane remained his sanctuary, but it no longer felt quite so isolated. He continued to tend his roses, to walk into town, to drink his coffee at the Sparrow's Nest. But now he did so with the knowledge that his sacrifices were not forgotten, that his honor was intact, and that even in the quietest corners of the world, true heroism can, eventually, find its voice and its recognition. The story of the day the helicopters came to Harmony Creek became a local legend, a reminder that respect is paramount, that courage comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most unassuming individuals carry the most extraordinary stories.